Good. I'd like to bring the evening session to a beginning. Let me introduce myself. I'm Everett Mendelsohn. I teach the history of science here at Harvard, and I trust in one way this will be an historic occasion worthy of my own observation and the observation of lots of others. The evening represents two efforts. The effort of a new group here in the Cambridge area, the Institute for Peace and International Security, which several of us have been engaged in bringing together to stretch the boundaries of the discussion of security and related foreign affairs issues. And this represents for us the second in a series of what will be monthly peace forums, with tonight's topic being as timely and as important as it is. We were very pleased that the Institute of Politics here at the John F. Kennedy School of Government took on the sharing of the evening to make sure that as broad an audience as was possible could listen to the issues, hear them discussed, hear them critically evaluated. It's just over 23 years since the Limited Test Ban Treaty was signed, and if my counting is right, we've witnessed approximately one nuclear test per week on an average since that time. Nuclear testing has gone on. The limit, of course, had nothing to do with numbers. There have been more per year since the test ban than before, but had to do with where the tests would be held, underground rather than in the atmosphere. One of the key issues in negotiating the limited ban that ultimately restricted the test ban treaty to those limits of holding tests underground rather than banning tests completely was the question of verification. The nature of the verification procedures, whether they could be on-site, whether they were technically adequate or not. Together with those arguments, which some thought were in place but others didn't, there were the politics of test ban in the late Eisenhower and early Kennedy years. Since that time, testing has gone on. To one extent or another, we'd have to say that so far as really severely limiting nuclear testing, governments of the United States and the Soviet Union have been in a kind of paralysis. It's against this background of misunderstanding, either conscious or unconscious, purposeful or non-purposeful. It's against this background that we witnessed in the recent months an extremely imaginative action taken by a non-governmental group and by a group of knowledgeable volunteers, people outside of government, outside of the traditional agencies, who asked themselves the question of could we really get underneath the verification issue. Tonight, Tom Cochrane, a member of that group, the National Resources Defense Council, for whom he's worked for 10 years, is going to tell us about that effort to deal directly with the question of verification. They're the group, you remember, which has installed 3 seismic posts within the Soviet Union alongside abutting the Soviet nuclear testing site, a site that has remained quiet for a year and a half now. Tom is senior staff scientist at the NRDC. He's a physicist, PhD from Vanderbilt University. Worked for the Navy and taught for 2 years at the postgraduate school of the Navy. He had worked previously for Resources for the Future and was the editor during these years of a book on breeder reactor programs. He's going to share with us through slides and discussion the intimate details and the inside questions of whether or not you can get a handle on the question of verification. Richard Haass, who will comment, raise questions, and perhaps offer alternate interpretations, is a lecturer in public policy here at the Kennedy School of Government. Most recently, he served in the State Department as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs from 1982 to 1985. Previously, he was at the Pentagon at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Europe, under whose aegis he wrote a paper, Congress and Foreign Policy, in 1978. The speakers will take the allotted time, following one after the other. After that, I hope we'll have about half the evening left for questions from the audience and discussion. First, it's a pleasure to welcome Tom Cochrane.
Thank you very much. I would first like to kindly thank my hosts, the Institute for Peace and International Studies, and of course the Kennedy School of Government for the honor and privilege of speaking here tonight. The Institute for Peace and International Studies was kind enough to entertain us for dinner at the Harvard Faculty Club. On leaving, I was admonished because I had hung my coat in the ladies' cloakroom rather than the men's cloakroom. I confess I went to one of those southern schools where the cloakrooms were integrated and the dormitories were segregated. I hope we'll get a chance to debate the administration's position on this matter as well as the test ban. It'll be interesting to know where Reagan comes out on that. Says he pleads the Fifth Amendment. Some 30 years ago, and also I might add I'm going to test whether my signal works to the slide projector. Some 30 years ago, the President Eisenhower said, I like to believe that people in the long run are going to do more to promote peace than our governments. Indeed, I think the people want peace so much that one of these days governments had better get out of their way and let them have it. It's in that spirit that I would like to tell you about the historic agreement between the Natural Resources Defense Council and the Soviet Academy of Sciences on nuclear test ban verification, and I'll describe the current status of the project. We're going to have to dim the lights, I believe, if you all are going to see the slides. Especially the one I have no control over these matters. And Richard's going to move off where he can see the slides, I hope. Is that the best we can do?
Right there.
We don't have these problems in the Soviet Union. How is that? Are we okay? If we could have the next slide. Since 1945, the U.S. has conducted over 830 tests, while the Soviet Union has conducted over 600. 1962 was the last year in which the U.S. And the Soviet Union conducted atmospheric tests. Next slide. In 1963, we signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, and since then all tests have been conducted underground. In 1974, the U.S. and the Soviet Union agreed on a threshold test ban which limited the underground test to 150 kilotons, 10 times larger than the explosion that destroyed Hiroshima. The U.S. has signed this treaty but never ratified it. Every president since from Eisenhower to Carter has sought to go the next step, total prohibition on all nuclear explosions. And on August 6, 1985, Secretary General Gorbachev declared a unilateral moratorium on further nuclear testing and challenged the U.S. to stop as well. The failure of the Reagan administration to respond to this opportunity has prompted efforts by other governments, including the Five Continent Peace Initiative and other organizations. And my own organization, the one that I work for, the Natural Resources Defense Council, has focused on the question of verification, which has been the major stumbling block with respect to a comprehensive test ban. In other words, how can we assure that the Soviets are not cheating? Last March, we first proposed this idea of a scientific exchange to demonstrate that verification was not an obstacle to a comprehensive test ban. The idea involved setting up seismic monitors around the principal test sites in each country. The stations were to be jointly operated by American and Soviet scientists, and this proposal was presented to both the U.S. and Soviet governments. And if I could have the next slide, in late May, I had the opportunity to go to Moscow next slide, and meet at the Soviet Academy of Sciences shown here. We had a workshop on the comprehensive test ban issue, which was attended by myself and Frank von Hippel from Princeton, and a couple of U.S. seismologists, Charles Archambault from the University of Colorado, Jack Everington from the U.S. Geological Survey. Following that workshop in May, we met with Vice President Velikov, who agreed to the NRDC proposal. The two-page agreement was quickly put together on the spot, and we agreed to come back that night and sign it. So we drafted the agreement. Velikov said he had to go for us to draft the agreement. He'd be back at 9 and we'd sign it, and indeed that's what happened. It was in the meantime translated and typed on in Russian and English. This agreement represents the first time ever that the Soviets have permitted foreign nationals on their soil to monitor nuclear tests. And under the agreement, which you can't read here, but the costs of the program are to be shared by NRDC and the Soviet Academy. And the agreement also specifies that we were to begin the operation within 1 month. Then that put us in something of a pickle, because at that point we did not have the equipment, the team, or the money to fulfill our obligations under the agreement. In effect, we went over and called their bluff, and they called ours in turn. And we said we don't have to wait for the governments to go through all the negotiations for a comprehensive test ban. We're prepared to put the equipment out. If you're really interested, let's get on with the program. And they said, we're really interested. And so we were left with having to assemble the team, and our work just began. And within a month, we had raised about $1 million to get the program started. And Charles Archambault at the University of Colorado selected the field team, the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla, California. And they agreed to take their equipment over within the month and set up a field program that would last for at least a year. And so on the end of June, we told the Soviets we're ready, and we're getting on the airplane on the 30th of June. And they said, wait a minute, we're not ready. And they stalled for a couple of days, and we ended up going over on the arriving on the 4th of July in Moscow, and we took with us, or I should say the Scripps people took with them about 2 tons of equipment in about 30 crates, and there were 9 scientists involved in this installation exercise, and we initially met in Moscow for 2 days with our counterparts at the Institute of the Physics of the Earth, very similar to the U.S. Geological Survey. They do the earthquake prediction work in the Soviet Union. Discussed the research program and the location of the stations and the instrumentation. And on the 8th of July, we then headed for the field. We have the next slide, which you may be able to see this better than I can. In the location of the stations is around their test site, shown in the black dot in the lower left corner, very close, as you can see, to the borders of Mongolia and China, about 400 miles, 500 miles away. And our stations are three dots on forming a triangle around the station. Test site, there are also 2 towns shown there, Karaganda and Semipalatinsk. If I could have the next slide. We first went to Karaganda, which is a coal mine built up in the 30s by Stalin out of prison labor for coal mining, and it's basically a coal mining area. We spent the night there and then headed, if I can, next slide, in these canvas wing biplanes across the steppes of Russia. Here you see the very flat lands, treeless steppes of southern Asia. Sort of interesting, you know, when you fly over Colorado, you can see how the farms are laid out according to the way the land was surveyed in townships and square miles and acres and so forth. Here they, if I could back up a slide, plow 20 miles in one direction, turn around, plow 20 miles back. We flew past, in the next slide, collective farms, mostly grow wheat in this region. And we were headed for, shown in the next slide, for our first station at a granite massif. This is a big granite outcropping, which is ideal for locating seismic instruments because the granite gives good sound conductivity right down to the base of the crustal area. And if I don't know whether you can see it, but in the foreground of this is a little resort for coal miners for the folks from Karaganda. And there's a little man-made lake out front, and our base station of operation is here at this place called Kokarolensk at the base of this granite station. Next slide. Here we're arriving at the dirt airstrip at Kokarolensk, and you see a ABC camera crew filming this. Next slide. Next slide. We were greeted by the young pioneers who came out to give us some flowers and sing a few songs. And next slide. We then headed off to Kokarolensk, which is a small farming village. Next slide. You see the cows in town as we pass through. Next slide. Then we arrive at this base of operation, this coal mining resort, which is seen sort of in the center of the picture on the other side of the lake. Next, began unpacking the equipment. Next, and set off into the into the granite rocks to locate the first temporary stations. Next, all filmed by ABC again. If you can read that T-shirt, I know you can see the slides. Next, we began installing surface seismometers. One of the types is shown here. This is the same instrument. It's standing upright with the outer case off of it is on the right. Basically, this operates like a stylus on your record player, converts vibratory motion into electric signals, and you have a fixed magnet sitting on the base of the seismometer, which is in effect riding on the surface of the Earth, and within that is suspended a heavy mass from a spring with a electrical coil around the heavy mass. And as the Earth moves up and down, the heavy mass is inertially fixed in space, and so you got a magnetic field passing by a coil, and you generate a signal. You send that signal off to any variety of recording instruments. In the next slide, we see the team installing one of the temporary recorders. Next, and here's a document that has more historical rather than scientific value. It's the first seismogram taken in the Soviet Union, but you can see this is on what's called a smoke paper recorder. The vertical wavy pen motion is recording earthquakes and local chemical explosions over about a 18-hour period overnight. Next slide. The team then began calibrating the instrumentation. Here they're creating their own earthquakes by dropping a heavy rock to make sure the instruments work, or Soviet style by dancing up and down on the ground. Next slide. This is a picture of another calibration measure called a cluster test, where you put all of the instruments on one rock and make sure you don't have a oddball instrument reading. You can sort of pick out the bad instruments by comparing the signals. Next. Here's just an example of one of the recorders. These are digital recorders, similar to, again, your audio CD player, which samples the electrical signal, say, about 100 times a second, and stores that on a magnetic tape. Next. Here's an example of one of the temporary stations, 5 seismometers located on a concrete pad laid on top of one of the granite rocks. Next. And the cabling is, there you see the box in the distance on the granite outcropping. Next slide shows one of the recorder boxes. It's locked to keep the there's some traffic of hikers in the area. People who worry about tampering, it's interesting that the Soviets were very concerned that somebody would come by and tamper with the equipment. And initially they wanted to post a guard out there to prevent tampering, but that's really not a problem. It hadn't been a problem. Next slide shows the inside with a variety of recording digital recorders. Next. And a sign that says stay away in Russian, in effect. Next slide. Here's back, shows a couple of our scientists back at the laboratory. Once the tapes are collected at the recording station, they can be brought back to the lab and run through a variety of readout instruments to check the data. We then take the digitized data and record it on floppy disks with a compact personal computer, give the Soviets a copy, and we bring a copy home. Next slide. Daily working meetings, comparing notes initially. Next. After we set up these temporary instruments, the equipment that the Scripps team took over with them, the field team went out to look for a site for permanent installations for much more sophisticated equipment that we'll go over in January. And here you see them looking for other areas. You try to find an area that's has a good granite outcropping but no trees in the area, so you don't get background noise picked up from the trees pulling on the roots pulling on the rocks when the wind blows. And you need to be close to electricity but far from people. That's not always easy to find, and so forth. And next slide. Here there some of the team, both U.S. and Soviets, hiking through this field looking for the right areas. Next. We then have since, between July and August, set up 3 stations at one at this initial place called Kakarolinsk that I pointed out, another about 100 kilometers north of Kakarolinsk called Bayanaul, which is a sort of a national park or resort area as well, very pretty area. And the third area to the east of the test site, below the town of Semipalatinsk, is on a collective farm called Karasu. And all of these look like they have very good seismic characteristics in terms of background noise, and we're very, very pleased with the sites. If I could have the next slide. Here we see the one of our team members being entertained in a tent out in the field near Semipalatinsk. We've had very warm relations with our counterparts and extremely good cooperation. Next slide. These next few slides were taken in October, in August, September, and early part of October. The Soviets started building the permanent installations at each of these sites for the more sophisticated equipment. And here you see a laboratory complex. There's an instrument trailer and a trailer to house U.S. and Soviet scientists. This slide was taken at Kukaralensk. Next slide. Here again you see the instrument trailer and one of the housing trailers. There'll be a trailer for Soviet scientists and a trailer for the American scientists. Next is the bedding in a not quite completed housing trailer. Next. At each of these laboratory compounds, there's cable trays that run off to an underground vault where the seismometers will be located about 1,000 feet away. The cables bring in the electric signals from the seismometers into the computers that will be in the instrument trailers to record and digitize or record the signals and analyze them. Next slide. Here's a reverse shot standing on the vault where the seismometers are located and looking off into the distance at the instrument compound. This is taken in a snow blizzard at Karasu in mid-October. Gets to be about minus 40 degrees over there in the middle of the winter, I'm told. If anyone wants to volunteer for February duty. Next slide. Here's John Berger, one of the co-leaders of the Scripps team, crawling into the underground vault. Next slide. And within this vault there's a borehole about 8 inches in diameter and goes down about 100 meters. And there will be a set of seismometers clamped to the base of that borehole so that we can minimize the noise level, the background noise level. There will be additional surface seismometers setting on a concrete slab, which is in turn in direct contact with the granite within this underground vault. The vault itself is about 10 feet cubed. Next slide. This is just a shot down the hole. My flash doesn't go all the way down, obviously. Next slide. Here's a meeting of our advisory committee. We have really a first-rate advisory committee. Many of these men are also advise the federal government, the DARPA and the Air Force and the CIA on measuring the yield of Soviet tests. Next slide. We have invited a team of Soviet seismologists over here to help select the sites around the Nevada test site, and they came over in November. The administration put some restrictions on their visas, in effect said you can't go look at the stations unless you're willing to go to the Nevada test site as guests of the federal government and witness a test and a Cortex demonstration. It's like saying you can go look at the cathedrals of Cologne if you'll first come to Bitburg. they decided that they would take the second option, which was to come as guests of the NRDC, which meant they were restricted to a 7-day visit by the administration and could only go to 4 cities, but not to look at the sites, which was the purpose of the visit. So we took them to Scripps in La Jolla and took some slides and rock samples and geologic maps, and we sat down and chose the 3 sites around the Nevada test site. One is at Nelson, which is just south of Las Vegas, another at Troy Canyon, just north of the test site, and the third one at Deep Springs just inside the California border. We anticipate that 2 of their team members will come back in January if visas are granted, and we'll begin installing the temporary equipment at these 3 stations. The plan is that in January we will take over about $500,000 of this more sophisticated seismic equipment to the Soviet Union. We received the export license for that this week, and we'll install that January and February. And then if we can get the boreholes dug and the permits to drill on Bureau of Land Management land, we will install the similar equipment, around the Nevada test site in about March or April. And so by next summer we should be fully operational both in the Soviet Union and here. At the moment we have 3 stations operating over there with the surface seismometers, and the team has been there continually since July 9th. We rotate the 2 seismologists on about a 6-week basis. We don't pretend to be verifying that there's no testing anywhere in the Soviet Union to cover the entire country under a comprehensive test regime, a test ban regime. The sort of experts in the field believe that it would require about 25 in-country stations and perhaps another 15 in surrounding countries to monitor down to 1 kiloton in explosive yield, assuming that explosion was in a large underground cavity where there's an attempt to cheat by muffling the sound, by decoupling the seismic signals of the explosion from the surrounding rock. And so, but we believe that the 3 stations that we are setting up will demonstrate that the technology works, and that the political will exists on the part of the Soviets to move ahead with a comprehensive test ban. This is the first time that Soviet scientists American scientists have been there. So I think there's very little else that the Soviets could do to really demonstrate their political desires to go back to the negotiating table on a comprehensive test ban. Negotiations were broken off by Carter in late '79 at the time of the Afghanistan invasion, and of course shortly thereafter Reagan was elected, and he has the first president of the last 7 who has decided that its comprehensive test ban is not in the national interest. I will close with those remarks and turn it over to Richard Haas and to respond, and after his response maybe we can have some give and take.
Well, I don't have any pictures, so those of you listening to this on radio will not be disadvantaged. I also feel I should congratulate those of you who did come here tonight. You are a hardy band to brave the weather. I should also add, though, perhaps, that I'm not unhappy that the size of the audience is modest. The last time I spoke here, the audience was several times larger. and the issue was whether the United States ought to be funding the Contras in Nicaragua. Those of you who know me can gather what side of that issue I was on, and to get booed by 1,000 people after one sentence, and then regularly throughout the evening, did not make for an easy night. So tonight, even if I turn out to be booed, at least the numbers will be small, and hopefully the sound resulting will be a bit less. What I thought I'd do tonight is really simply ask and try to answer three questions. The first, can a comprehensive test ban be verified? Second, if there were a comprehensive test ban, would the Soviet Union be likely to comply with it? And thirdly, arguing for a moment, or accepting the argument rather, that a comprehensive test ban indeed could be verified, and indeed the Soviets would comply with it, even granting those two arguments, would the United States want one in any case? So let me turn to all three questions fairly briefly, and let me, though, just take a minute out for a few definitions, just so we all know, at least we have some of our terms down. The first is monitoring. By monitoring, what I will mean is simply the collecting of information and the processing of it. It is simply a technological undertaking, and it is something that we do all the time. I want to distinguish, therefore, monitoring, which again is simply technical, from verification. And when I use verification, what I will mean is the taking of this information, which is gathered through monitoring, which is then processed, and matching it against the provisions of existing or contemplated agreements. And that is what I mean by verification. As a result, it encompasses a technical activity, but also includes a political one, because it involves a matching of information to provisions of arms control agreements. And thirdly, let me distinguish both monitoring and verification from compliance. Compliance, then, is a totally political judgment that takes the results of monitoring, takes the results of verification, and then reaches a conclusion about whether or not, in this case from our perspective, the Soviet Union is acting consistently with the provisions of the agreement. It is therefore a more final judgment, and it is a political judgment. Okay, given those three definitions, back to my first question. Can a comprehensive test ban be verified? In the spirit of simplicity, let me make my answer simple. No. If the criteria is that we are supposed to have confidence that no test could occur without our knowing it, the answer is no. There is no way that a comprehensive test ban could be verified. Tests at the low kiloton level or sub-kiloton level could go on. So what the challenge is not, I would argue, measuring tests at the level of the threshold agreement, the 150 kiloton level, but we are talking down the road a comprehensive test ban, small kilotons, sub-kiloton. Again, we could not have absolute confidence. What do we need, though, to get some fairly good confidence? The first would be a large number of the seismic stations would have to be placed in the Soviet Union. You're talking about a landmass of over 20 million square kilometers, if my geography serves me right. We are therefore talking about a large number of these seismic stations, as I said. Some people, from Mr. Cochran, we heard 25. I have heard numbers much larger, whether 100 or sometimes 200 or even more. But let me just try to place these numbers in historical perspective. In the late 50s and early 60s, at the time of what many people hoped would be a comprehensive test ban and what turned out to be the limited test ban, simply banning atmospheric tests, the numbers that were talked about in terms of on-site inspections, and I'll get to that in a minute, were something several a year, somewhere between 3 and 6. When we were talking about the comprehensive test ban under the Carter administration in the late 70s, when we were talking about seismic stations and the rest, we were talking a maximum of 10 per country. So we are talking something several times higher and perhaps much more than that when it comes to seismic stations. Secondly, there is a dilemma about those facing those who are interested in a comprehensive test ban. And the dilemma is a simple one. If your goal is to be able to detect with confidence any test that might be going on, you obviously have to have the ability to detect tests at very low levels, 1 kiloton, 2 kiloton, and so forth. The problem is that as you build instrumentation sensitive enough to discern these tests, the same instrumentation will also tend to pick up an awful lot else that is going on. Things like earthquakes, things like volcanic eruptions, things like drilling, commercial, industrial activities, and the rest. So there is a dilemma. The sensitivity required for discernment of nuclear tests creates a lot more background noise, and hence an awful lot of ambiguous situations for you to then have to find out what indeed is going on. The question then becomes, okay, you follow this up with what? With on-site inspections, which tends to go hand in hand with those who are interested in the comprehensive test ban, in a sense to follow up what your more sensitive seismic stations will pick up. And the problem there is simply that you will then have an awful lot of challenges, and the Soviet Union would again have to agree to a degree of openness that has heretofore been totally uncharacteristic of a rather closed social and political system. And indeed, what you would be asking for is a degree of cooperation from the Soviet Union, not simply a number of inspections, but inspections anywhere. The Soviet Union would also have to provide detailed seismic mapping information, which they have yet to do. The Soviet Union would not only have to agree to an unprecedented number of inspections all over its territory, but would have to agree that these could take place immediately after ambiguous tests were picked up, because time can degrade one's ability to visit a site and learn from it. In a sense, all of this would require a degree of cooperation that it would not only be uncharacteristic of the Soviet Union, I would maintain, but would be totally uncharacteristic of the U.S.-Soviet relationship. Indeed, I would almost go on to say, if the Soviet Union were that willing to cooperate, I doubt the relationship would be sufficiently adversarial, so we would need to pursue arms control agreements such as a comprehensive test ban. You will have defined away the problem. So I, for one, find it hardly likely that, unless, in a sense, this zebra changes its stripes, that we would ever get into that kind of a situation. Lastly, with other problems, is the one of on-site inspection. Not simply that I said that the lapse of time is very important, the idea that one has to have access to the entire country and so forth, that we need better mapping information, but there's a limit as well. That on-site inspection, even together with seismic stations, even a large number of each, is not a panacea. There are many environments which can be used to mask or hide or conceal underground tests. One has certain geologic formations, and I should point out before I go any further that I am not a physical scientist. I am not a real one, as I say. I'm simply a political one. And my only geology background was a course at Oberlin in the 60s, which was conveniently known as Rocks for Jocks. But be that as it may, it is my understanding from talking to those who are more qualified than I in this area that there really can be a certain masking, if it is deliberate, of these tests, particularly once you move down to this very low level, a level which it is important to point out does and can have military utility. Bottom line being, can a CTB, can a comprehensive test ban be verified? I would argue no. Secondly, would the Soviet Union comply with the comprehensive test ban? Again, to all my students who are here, in my uncharacteristic or perhaps characteristic display of simplicity, I would say maybe. What is the record? Well, we at Harvard have just completed a rather large, thorough study of the history of nuclear arms control between the United States and the Soviet Union, and I had the fortune, good or otherwise, to write the section on compliance. What is relevant for our purposes here? A few things. The first is that in the area of the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which one might argue is the most important piece of historical evidence, the Soviet record is far from perfect. There we have clear, unambiguous violations of the 1963 agreement in the area of the venting, in that sense, the release of radioactive debris across the borders of the Soviet Union. One can argue that this release of debris across the borders of the Soviet Union was not military significant, and indeed the United States at times vented across its border illegally, but it is clear, and I'm talking from my own experience based from conversations with people involved in the negotiations and involved very deeply since, that the degree of Soviet venting of radioactive debris was so massive and was so predictable that it could only have come about from testing, knowing full well that the kind of test the Soviet Union was doing would result in clear violations of the agreement. It reflected nothing more, nothing less than a blatant disregard for this provision of the treaty. I just think that's something one has to accept. I'm not saying that is necessarily predictive or determinant of future behavior, but I don't think we can ignore it. Soviet record of compliance towards the treaties of the early 70s, which, to be fair, were never ratified. The administration has described the Soviet behavior as ambiguous. By that, they mean that the margin of error in our verification is simply not sufficiently small so as to determine whether or not the Soviet Union actually tested above the 150 kiloton level or not. That's just an open question. More generally, what can we say about the Soviet compliance record? I would say two things. At a minimum, the Soviet Union has behaved in a manner in which they have exploited numerous ambiguities, loopholes, areas of vagueness, you name it, in the arms control area. I would argue that the Soviet Union has pushed up, at a minimum, against the edge of many of its arms control undertakings in a way that, even if they did not violate the letter of the undertaking, clearly created doubt as to their political commitment to the undertaking. More important, there are some clear violations. I mentioned one already in the context of the Limited Test Ban Treaty. I would also think there is a clear violation in the area of the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in the Soviet construction of the Krasnoyarsk radar. Again, I'm not saying that past performance is in any way determinative of what will follow in the future, but I do think it is important to note, and it is at least suggestive. Okay, but let's argue for a moment, or accept for a moment, 2 points, neither of which obviously I have made. Firstly, that a comprehensive test ban would be verifiable, and second of all, that the Soviet Union, regardless of what it's done in the past, would comply with it. Under these circumstances, would the United States want one? Should the United States support a comprehensive test ban? Again, in the interest of simplicity, let me come out of the closet. It may come as little surprise. I would argue not. I would say that a comprehensive test ban is not in the national security interests of the United States. I would say so largely for 2 reasons. First, a degree of nuclear testing, I think, is useful for maintaining the reliability of the existing nuclear deterrent. Secondly, a degree of nuclear testing is useful, indeed necessary, for modernizing the nuclear deterrent. One can question the desirability of either of these goals, and that's fine. That's a legitimate argument. That's one I'm willing to enter into. My own view, though, is that both of these activities, reliability testing and modernization, and the testing that is associated with modernization, both can and do contribute to nuclear deterrence. If then one is a supporter of nuclear deterrence, as I am, I think one has the responsibility to follow through on that logically and therefore oppose a comprehensive test ban. So then, where am I in conclusion? Let me just say a few things. One is, I think the kinds of cooperative measures we have heard described here tonight are useful. I think they are interesting, but I also think they are modest. And I think that we've got to keep them in perspective. They are steps in the right direction, but I do not think they are steps in the right direction in a sense that they are necessarily going to lead to a final goal that is either possible or, in my view, desirable. All the verification in the world, all the monitoring in the world will not lead to our ability to verify with high confidence a comprehensive test ban. Secondly, I would argue that compliance concerns will remain, and that, in any case, the desirability question, I would argue, takes precedence over the feasibility questions related to verification and compliance. One final thought, and then I will stop. Some people might even agree with me and say that, yes, a comprehensive test ban may have slight negative impact on military concerns. But on balance, a comprehensive test ban is worth it because the political dividends that would flow from it are so enormous. Let me just, as my British friends would say it, put a spanner in the works there and suggest that the opposite may be the case. That if I am right, an absolute confidence in verification cannot be assured, and that a degree of ambiguity would remain. I would argue that the process not simply of negotiating a comprehensive test ban, but living under one, could actually be quite confidence-reducing rather than enhancing. And what we could find ourselves in is a never-ending problem with tremendous tensions resulting from a situation of unclear Soviet behavior, possible violations, possible testing going on, that I think could not be resolved, that this ambiguity could not be resolved. So not only would we have, in my view, the negative military consequences of a comprehensive test ban, but I think we would also have adverse political consequences. And I think over time we would not only find that our confidence in deterrence had diminished, but possibly the entire reason for entering into this dialogue and into this agreement, into a comprehensive test ban, to enhance confidence that we had actually achieved the opposite result. For those reasons, while I applaud the efforts of my colleagues to the right, I also would hope that it would not lead to national policy on a larger scale.
Thank you very much. We've had two presentations. Richard Haas has presented a strong and unambiguous brief against a comprehensive test ban, exploring what he saw as the ambiguities that would arise if one were achieved. Tom Cochrane has detailed an experiment focused on the thorny questions of verification and what might be achieved in an independent experiment, social experiment of this sort. It's time now for questions and exchanges across the table here. Sure. Tom, do you want to take a minute? You can do it from your spot unless you need the...
Well, I won't attempt to respond to all of these issues, but would like to make a few observations. One with respect to the number of stations. It's clear in terms of monitoring and verification that at some level, in terms of the number of stations, you can do the job. I mean, and the question is, does it take 100 stations or 25 or 10? I would point out that during the negotiations with in the late 70s under the Carter administration, the administration agreed with the Soviets and the British to establish 10 stations in the U.S., 10 in the Soviet Union, and 10 on British territories, Commonwealth territories. This was probably less than a compromise, less than the U.S. Experts would have liked to have seen, but it sort of puts you in the ballpark of what the technical experts within the government were thinking at least a decade ago, before we had the improvements in the technology and the methodology that should lower that number. Secondly, I would call your attention to an article in the Reviews of Geophysics of May of this year by Archambault and Everington and Chanswick, who have done the studies of the number of stations, and their estimate is about 25 in-country and 15 external, which is the number I gave you earlier. Now, the criticism by the skeptics of their paper is that it's based on some assumptions about background noise and seismic attenuation inside the Soviet Union that must be confirmed. And I can tell you that our stations will confirm to a limited extent or refute their data, because we'll be measuring background noise levels and attenuation characteristics, at least in this area of the Soviet Union, which is the first time anybody has been able to do that. There was a proposal offered at the same time that we offered the NRDC proposal to the Academy to do nationwide survey of background noise and attenuation throughout the Soviet Union and the U.S. And the Soviet Academy said, wrote back the Everenden at the USGS and said, if you're willing to, if the U.S. is willing to join our moratorium, we're willing to discuss implementation of your proposal. So that proposal, I believe, can be exercised if we have a moratorium, and we can expand the verification program and find out how many stations would be required. With regard to on-site inspections, you know, you don't resolve these issues of how many on-site inspections will be permitted and what sort of roadblocks will be thrown up and so forth, unless you go to the negotiating table and ask the questions and find out what you can get. And in fact, this administration really takes the position of Mr. Haas, and that is to argue that what the answer is going to be before they go to the negotiating table. And I would suggest that they ought to try the other way around. Go to the negotiation table, tell them what you want, and see if you can get it. And in fact, that's what we did when we went to the Soviet Union, and everybody in the country said there's not a snowball's chance that they're going to let you set up these seismic instruments in the Soviet Union. They've never done it before. They won't negotiate with a private entity. You'll never get it. Well, you don't know until you ask. With respect to concealing seismic events and this issue of whether or not ambiguous events and so forth, first of all, by going to these high frequencies and the types of instrumentation we're putting in place, you can discriminate between explosions and earthquakes. There are a number of ways you can make the discrimination. The very first cut you make, incidentally, is just to triangulate and locate the event. And if it's below 10 kilometers underground, you're confident that it's an earthquake. If it's shallow, you have to go to look at the data more carefully to make the distinction. But he's correct in that if you go to lower and lower and lower yields, gets much more difficult and much more ambiguities. And the real ambiguities crop up when you're well below a kiloton. So if there's a real problem in terms of ambiguities at these low yields, you can always have a low threshold test ban, which this administration opposes. And you can establish a threshold at a kiloton or 10 kilotons, which would be vastly superior to the present regime where the threshold is at 150 kilotons, and you can construct new weapons as of twice that yield and certify them. With regard to the reliability argument, that's a phony argument. We don't test the reliability of weapons by through a nuclear testing program. We determine the reliability by tearing them apart and looking at the degradation of components and so forth and testing the components. There have been occasions when through that process you've detected flaws in the design, and people have gone back and confirmed the corrections through testing. So the argument is reduced to whether one needs to test to reconfirm the reliability. There are experts on both sides of that issue, including within the weapons community, people like Hans Bader, Richard Garwin, Carson Mark, George Rathkins, Bradbury, Keeney, Panofsky, Scoville, Warnke, have all published and argued that you do not need to test to ensure the reliability of weapons that are currently in the stockpile. Now, most of the problems that we have had in terms of reliability were weapons that were not thoroughly tested before they entered the stockpile. Weapons that we put in the stockpile, for example, during a moratorium of 58 to 62. Now, if reliability is a problem, hey, let's have an agreement that allows one test per year, because that's the most that he could ever say is needed to confirm the reliability of the existing stockpile. In fact, the issue is what he calls modernization, which is a euphemism for meaning we want to introduce new warheads into the stockpile ad infinitum, forever and ever. And if you want to stop third-generation warfare weapons from entering the stockpiles of the Soviet Union and the United States, principally the Soviet Union from my point of view, then you ought to have a test ban. If you want third-generation nuclear weapons in the stockpiles of these two countries, and you want to escalate the nuclear threat in that regard, then vote with my friend Mr. Haas for no test ban. If you want to keep them out of the stockpile, vote with me. Let's go back to the negotiating table, see what we can get. If we don't like what we see, we don't have to sign a treaty.
We can have some questions now, entertain questions to either or both of the speakers, and I'm sure they'll take a chance for further exchanges between themselves. Yeah, right over here first and then here.
Up until a few months ago, I had doubts about the honesty and integrity.
And ask the questions and find out what you can get. And in fact, this administration questions and find out what you can get. And in fact, this administration really takes the position of Mr. Haas, and that is to argue that what the answer is going to be before they go to the negotiating table. And I would suggest that they ought to try the other way around. Go to the negotiation table, tell them what you want, and see if you can get it. And in fact, that's what we did when we went to the Soviet Union, and everybody in the country said there's not a snowball's chance that they're going to let you set up these seismic instruments in the Soviet Union. They've never done it before. They won't negotiate with a private entity. You'll never get it. Well, you don't know until you ask. With respect to concealing seismic events and this issue of whether or not ambiguous events and so forth, first of all, by going to these high frequencies and the types of instrumentation we're putting in place, you can discriminate between explosions and earthquakes. There are a number of ways you can make the discrimination. The very first cut you make, incidentally, is just to triangulate and locate the event. And if it's below 10 kilometers underground, you're confident that it's an earthquake. If it's shallow, you have to go to look at the data more carefully to make the distinction. But he's correct in that if you go to lower and lower and lower yields, it gets much more difficult and much more ambiguities. And the real ambiguities crop up when you're well below a kiloton. So if there's a real problem in terms of ambiguities at these low yields, you can always have a low threshold test ban, which this administration opposes. And you can establish a threshold at a kiloton or 10 kilotons, which would be vastly superior to the present regime where the threshold is at 150 kilotons, and you can construct new weapons as of twice that yield and certify them. With regard to the reliability argument, that's a phony argument. We don't test the reliability of weapons through a nuclear testing program. We determine the reliability by tearing them apart and looking at the degradation of components and so forth and testing the components. There have been occasions when through that process you've detected flaws in the design, and people have gone back and confirmed the corrections through testing. So the argument is reduced to whether one needs to test to reconfirm the reliability. There are experts on both sides of that issue, including within the weapons community, people like Hans Bethe, Richard Garwin, Carson Mark, George Rathkins, Bradbury, Keeney, Panofsky, Scoville, Warnke, have all published and argued that you do not need to test to ensure the reliability of weapons that are currently in the stockpile. Now, most of the problems that we have had in terms of reliability were weapons that were not thoroughly tested before they entered the stockpile. Weapons that we put in the stockpile, for example, during a moratorium of 58 to 62. Now, if reliability is a problem, hey, let's have an agreement that allows one test per year, because that's the most that he could ever say is needed to confirm the reliability of the existing stockpile. In fact, the issue is what he calls modernization, which is a euphemism for meaning we want to introduce new warheads into the stockpile ad infinitum, forever and ever. Now, if you want to stop third-generation warfare weapons from entering the stockpiles of the Soviet Union and the United States, principally the Soviet Union from my point of view, then you ought to have a test ban. If you want third-generation nuclear weapons in the stockpiles of these two countries, and you want to escalate the nuclear threat in that regard, then vote with my friend Mr. Haas for no test ban. If you want to keep them out of the stockpile, vote with me. Let's go back to the negotiating table, see what we can get. If we don't like what we see, we don't have to sign a treaty.
We can have some questions now, entertain questions to either or both of the speakers, and I'm sure they'll take a chance for further exchanges between themselves. Yeah, right over here first and then here.
Up until a few months ago, I had doubts about the honesty and integrity of the Russians in keeping to their promises. The past couple of months, what's been going on in Washington, can you believe what our government in Washington is saying and doing? The Russians are talking about disarmament. They're talking about testing. And what are we doing? We're not talking about it. Every single time the Russians come up with a comment that they're willing to allow for testing, for disarmament, we look the other way. I can't understand. You know, one of our observers at the SALT II conference said this back a couple of years ago, that as far as he's concerned, the Russians have lived up to their commitments of the SALT II. And if we are really so concerned about peace, how come we haven't signed the SALT II treaty? I mean, I don't know. You know, it's nice to condemn the Russians, but what about what we're doing or not doing?
Okay, do either of you want to comment on the comment?
I would just like to sort of redirect the discussion. I'm not asking for you to trust the Soviets. I'm suggesting that we can establish the seismic stations in the Soviet Union that we believe, that our experts believe, are necessary to verify a comprehensive test ban, a low-threshold test ban, under the assumption that we don't trust the Soviets. If we trust the Soviets, we're that much better off, but I frankly don't need to. The Soviets have afforded us the opportunity to set up the stations so that we think are necessary. Verification is a U.S. issue. It's not a Soviet issue. They're not beating on the doors to come to the Nevada test site to verify whether or not testing is going on and what yields. They're telling us, okay, verification's a problem for you. We'll try to take care of it.
Good. Question over here.
Mr. Haas, you mentioned that you thought that absolute confidence was unattainable in verifying a test ban, and that some considerable ambiguities would remain. But isn't that characteristic of all arms control agreements? And if that's the case, are you philosophically opposed to any arms control?
It's an interesting question. Let me say a few things about it. I am in favor of arms control in principle for the very reason that it tends to reduce uncertainty and predictability. Indeed, I would think that in assessing the contribution of arms control, probably the best thing that can be said about it is that, in fact, it has enhanced predictability in two ways. It has put a ceiling on the threat. At least we know what it's going to be. And secondly, it has set out certain rules of the road for governing the monitoring process, without which we would have a much poorer idea of what the Soviet Union would be up to. And I would argue we probably have many more weapons than we now have. So I would think that arms control has made a real contribution in the area of increasing, if you will, transparency. It has reduced uncertainty, and I think has contributed in important ways to the stability of the U.S.-Soviet relationship. Secondly, I think ambiguity is an inherent part of arms control. It is a little bit like the problem you face in taxes, in the tax code, if you try to eliminate ambiguity. If you say there are 20 ways in which you cannot take deductions, I am sure some smart lawyer will come up with the 21st and find a way to evade taxes, or in this case, avoid taxes so it's not illegal. The same thing comes up in arms control. If you try to specify so much to avoid any ambiguity, one, it becomes terribly hard to negotiate an agreement. To some extent, the ambiguity.
I agree with that, but that's what you were suggesting we do
in
the case of the test ban.
Give me a minute to finish, and maybe I'll get to your point there. That some ambiguity is necessary to negotiate. And second of all, if you get too specific, you will, in a sense, encourage ways of designing around, if you will, what it is you say people can't do. So ambiguity is a double-edged sword. At the same time, too much ambiguity, and this gets to my problem with the a comprehensive test ban, too much ambiguity does create license for activities that you may want to limit or eliminate. And I question the wisdom of having a comprehensive test ban if indeed, not only in and of itself, if one could eliminate ambiguity, and you've heard me say that why I'm against it in and of itself, but because one can't. And I would find that living with that degree of ambiguity would actually create such uncertainty in the U.S.-Soviet relationship that I think over time would actually contribute to tensions rather than ameliorate them.
I would like to just make a few observations. I'd be interested to know when I get through whether you support our continuing jointly with the Soviets to abide by the 150 kiloton limit under the threshold test ban treaty, which, as you point out, there's a ambiguous determination of whether or not you're complying within, say, 20% or 50%, depending on who's doing the analysis. But maybe let's address that first, and then I'll come back.
I want to address that and one other thing you mentioned, and actually agree with you on. I have no problems with continuing to abide by the 150 kiloton limit. Indeed.
Let's stop. Now let's lower it to 10 kilotons.
Well, there you get into the question of whether it's 10 kilotons or whatever. Let me sort of give my two criteria for whatever level of kilotons you want to set. One is I do not want to set a limit so low that we cannot carry out necessary modernization, replacement, innovation, come up with your euphemism. And secondly, I do not want to set up a limit below which we can confidently monitor. And we can now, right now, we can argue where those twin requirements would set that level. Most people are pretty confident that 150 kilotons is not beyond that limit if adequate verification provisions are established and monitoring capabilities are allowed to be established. If that can happen, it clearly would not impede the kinds of necessary military modernization we think is necessary to sustain deterrence. So the administration position, and I happen to think it's right, is that if we can negotiate with the Soviets adequate monitoring provisions, great, let's sign the agreement.
Let's get a couple of other questions over here on the right.
Well, I have three technical questions for Mr. Cochran. The first is that you've been monitoring in the Soviet Union for some time now. You've obviously observed some U.S. tests. And I'm not a seismologist, but I think that in principle this allows you to estimate or to give some idea of Soviet compliance with the threshold test ban treaty. I'm wondering if you've calculated the bias and what that says for compliance with the TTBT. Second point is that you said that 20 stations or 25 in-country stations, you could verify comprehensive test ban down to, I think you said, 1 kiloton decoupled. I think that would only be true if the 25 stations were arrays, that would allow you to detect down to 1/10 of a kiloton fully coupled. And if you claim that high-frequency detection only allows decoupling factors of, say, a factor of 10. That was the second point. And the third point is that I think Mr. Haas has a point about the false alarm rate, because when you go down this low to body wave magnitudes of, say, about 3.0, you have about 1,000 shallow earthquakes each year in the Soviet Union. Now, it's true that you can use some discriminants to separate out which are probably not explosions, which are most likely earthquakes, but the need to only have a small false alarm rate, which would require on-site inspections, say, 5 on-site inspections a year, would lower the verification criteria for any single test to about 50%. So it's not really true that you could say, as Mr. Haas mentioned, that you could have confidence in detecting any single test. I would agree that you might have confidence in detecting a series of tests, but it seems to me that the requirement to keep the false alarm rate small would necessarily allow the possibility of 1 or 2 tests not being detected.
Well, first of all, with respect to your first question about whether we're monitoring U.S. tests, in fact, with the surface seismometers we have in the Soviet Union now, we've recorded 3 tests at the Nevada test site. Sizable tests, but that's a quarter of the way around the world. It gives you some idea of the sensitivity of the instrumentation. With the equipment that we plan to take over and put in the deep boreholes to reduce noise environment, we believe we can monitor tamped explosions at the test site on the order of a few tons. A few tons, mind you. And so even if you have a decoupling factor of a factor of 10 or 100, well, decoupling is a fancy way of saying you're going to muffle the sound of the explosion. And you do that by setting the explosion off in the center of a hollow cavity so that you don't get good transmission of the shock wave into the surrounding rock. There's a limit as to how much theoretical limit as to how much you can decouple. And there were tests by the U.S. government of this decoupling in some salt domes in Louisiana, Mississippi, and the experimental evidence suggests that it's more difficult to decouple than one thinks. But nevertheless, even if you accept that one can do better than the U.S. has done in the past on this, there's a limit to how good one can do. And so if we can hear a tamped explosion, one way there's no attempt to muffle the sound on the order of a few tons or a few tens of tons, then the comparable decoupled explosion would be, let's say, 10 times that great or 100 times that great. Depends on what frequency range you're looking in and a number of factors. Well, that's correct. But I mean, I just want to put out gives people some feeling of what the capability of this equipment. The array in Norway listens to tests at Semipalatinsk, 2,000 miles away, on the order tamped explosions, on the order of a quarter of a kiloton. So if they tried to untamp it, you can hear from Norway explosions, say, 10 times larger. But we believe that with the 25 stations throughout the Soviet Union, even in these other areas, you can go down to a kiloton. And if you want to debate that, my suggestion is to go look at the technical reviews by Everenden and Archambault and debate the parameters they use. With regard to your questions about discrimination, my first observation is It's interesting that I'm not pointing to you, but perhaps the people in the administration that raise these arguments. These are the same people that think we can put up the Star Wars program, that don't think we can analyze 1,000 seismic events and do the discrimination analysis. I think we can put together the computer power to do the discrimination of a quite large number of events. The manpower and computer power, it's rather small compared to the investment we put in the design and the testing of the weapons themselves. You will run into a problem at some level, and my suggestion is let's negotiate what level we think we don't have too many outliers or too many ambiguous events, and we can handle it through on-site inspections. But again, you got to go to the negotiating table to resolve those issues, and the administration's unwilling to do that.
Time is closing in on us. Let's see if we can move a couple of questions along quickly. Over here, please.
Mr. Haas, you have said that you're not against arms control agreements because they increase how much you know what the other side is doing. You put it in different terms, but I think you understand what I'm saying. If we were able to install 25 seismic bases in the Soviet Union so that we knew that anything over 1 kiloton, be it decoupled or whatever, we would know about it, wouldn't that increase our knowledge of what the Soviet Union is testing by several orders of magnitude? Therefore, wouldn't that be very good and stabilizing?
In principle, I would have no problem with increasing our knowledge of what the Soviet testing program is up to. I think that would be great. And if the Soviet Union would increase our confidence in our ability to monitor their testing, I, for one, would celebrate it. And I would be willing to perhaps enter into, if not a comprehensive test ban, a much more limited test ban, where one could put limits both on the numbers of tests permitted by each side each year, and one could put perhaps some much lower limits, way below 150 kilotons. Again, there's two criteria. One is the verification. If the Soviet Union helps us meet that criteria so we can lower things, great. And then I'd say the other criteria becomes, again, your modernization needs, and that's a much larger discussion, which really goes beyond tonight's talk. It really is, what are the requirements of deterrence in a dynamic context? And we can argue that at length, but if the Soviet Union is willing to do what you say, that would clearly, if not eliminate, drastically reduce that impediment to moving ahead on a test ban.
The Soviet Union has indicated at Reykjavik that they're willing to consider, in the context of CTB negotiations and moving in the direction of a CTB, reduced thresholds and quotas. The administration is opposed to reduced thresholds and quotas because the administration wants to continue to introduce new warhead designs into the stockpile.
Just to be clear on that, the letter that President Reagan sent to Mr. Gorbachev in the summer of 1986, several months ago, did include the possibility of negotiating a new test ban agreement with quotas and lower levels, and this was part of the package which got hoisted, if you will, on the question of SDI. So it was in there, the administration was willing to do that, and in principle, I don't see this administration being opposed, again, contingent on satisfactory verification arrangements.
Let's take what I think has to be the final question over here.
Okay, Mr. Haas, this is just looking at your 3 points. One point that it's impossible or nearly impossible to verify. 2, that the Soviet Union has a bad record, just as the United States would with a treaty. And 3, that it's not good for the United States' interest to have this test ban. I'm just wondering, why then would the Soviet Union unilaterally put up a test ban, considering that the same possibilities are for them? Is it all a propaganda thing, or do you feel that the Soviet Union is just an evil state and they're going to come knocking at our back door?
Well, without trying to characterize the nature of the Soviet Union or their ultimate objectives, let me just say they're not above using arms control as a political instrument. And if they can use arms control offers to, in some ways...
We wouldn't do that, would we?
I'm not saying... No, it's a fair point. Arms control is a political process, and both sides do it, of course. So when the Soviet Union makes an offer of a moratorium, I would suggest to you that we look at what might be motivating them politically and how much, what they are really willing to give up. and so forth. Just like when we make arms control offers, yes, you should look at the political rationales and motivations of those. Arms control is not a technical process. It is not even fundamentally a military process. It is a political process that may have technical aspects and certainly may have military consequences. But at its essence, it is fundamentally political. And I think that's something we have to keep in mind when, for example, discussing a comprehensive test ban.
I think their motive is identical with the motive of Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Carter, and that is to stop nuclear testing as one means of putting the brakes on an out-of-control arms race.
Let me sort of give it my own hunch in the for what it's worth category is that if the United States ever did get serious about a comprehensive test ban, you could expect the Soviet Union to run very fast away from it. The Soviet Union...
Good reason not to discuss it, isn't it?
Let me just quickly say two things. One, the Soviet Union has a tremendous investment in its military power and in its nuclear armaments. I do not see them wanting to give that up. It is a one-dimensional superpower. Why not try it? I do not think the United States ought to advocate agreements that, if accepted, would not be in our interest. I, for one, find that too cynical, and I, for one, would not accept that or recommend that.
Gentlemen, let me thank you for what has been an extremely interesting and, in its way, very focused discussion. What became very clear are similarities in some judgments, stark differences in others, some technical, others quite political. The issue is obviously one which will be decided outside these halls, but will obviously be decided sometime in the coming years. Thank you, gentlemen.